I received an email from Mike in Bloomington, Indiana, and he asked if I could help him identify some wood. He had a piece of furniture that he was trying to repair, did not know what type of wood it was. He sent me about a half a dozen photos. So this is my response to Mike. If I had to guess, and that is all it is, a guess, I'd suggest Nara, a Southeast Asia wood used in a lot of imported furniture. Wood ID is really tricky, especially if you try to get an exact species. You might get a family like mahogany, as you mentioned, but it could be walnut. It's really hard to ID from photos sometimes. It's always helpful to know the origin of the piece, where the object was made, and when. One of the most useful resources is the wood database, and I give the URL here. If you can look at an end grain slice, that would really narrow it down. Sounds like a podcast episode. Thanks. So Mike, I hope that helped you out, and hopefully this episode number 37, What Wood Is That?, will help everyone else who is working at woodworking. My name's Roger Kugler. My goal is to get a lot of amateur woodworkers into either a part-time or a full-time woodworking service, servicing your community with everything from custom inlaid floors to furniture repair to new construction of dining room tables and chairs and bookcases and just all kinds of things that people are looking for skilled professionals to do for them. So today we're going to tackle wood identification. If you've been a woodworker more than 15 minutes, you have probably had someone ask you, what wood is this? And typically, a lot of times, your reply is, that's a pine 2x4. But you could really blow their mind by saying, it's really hard to tell because 2x4s now are rated as SPF, spruce, pine, fir. There's a lot of genetic manipulation done in commercial construction lumber now to produce trees that grow very fast, very tall, very straight, and make good building materials. So that pine 2x4, well, it may not actually be pine. And unless you're a geneticist, you might not actually be able to figure out what it is. So they just slap the label on SPF. You'll see this stamped on, any construction grade lumber, not to be confused with southern yellow pine, which is a totally different type of construction material. So how do we actually get around to identifying wood? How do you go about doing this? You as an individual professional. Well, you're going to have to study dendrology, the study of trees. Now, I was introduced to this by Ron Herman. He was a gentleman who was a fixture at the woodworking shows, which anyone in the Midwest to the East Coast, I even think they went to the West Coast, was familiar with these shows, wonderful shows. I hear they are coming back for 2023. I was on their website recently, and they're starting to put together a full schedule, providing we don't get stupid again. Anyway, Ron studied dendrology in college, Ohio State University, and he used that throughout his professional life. I've kind of lost track of him. I don't know what he's doing. His website no longer exists, so hope everything's okay. So I think one of the best resources that you can start with in your study of dendrology is what I had mentioned to Mike, the wooddatabase.com, link in show notes. It's a fantastic website. They list hundreds of different species of trees. There's really good photography of just a plain overall view of a piece of wood, and then microscopic close-ups of end grain and flat grain. Sometimes they'll throw in plates of different color variations, a lot of information about the wood, the shrinkage characteristics, the workability of that particular species. If you are not familiar, you need to definitely check it out. They have books which are a little expensive, but well worth the money. Really, really great books. Posters, just all kinds of things. I even think they sell t-shirts. So that's the first step that you need to go to. The second place you need to go to is the United States Department of Agriculture, U.S. Forest Service Laboratory website. Yeah, link in the show notes. This is a laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin. It's in association with University of Wisconsin there in Madison. This was a program that was started in the early turn of the century, well, around 1907, 1909, someplace in there. They established a program, and it really expanded in the 1930s as part of the New Deal, the rebuilding during the Great Depression. And they do all kinds of science-y type things. In World War I, they were instrumental in identifying available wood species that were suitable for the rapid building of aircraft. They would analyze propeller designs, because remember, back then propellers were made of wood, and there are some really unique characteristics that you have to pay attention to when you're building a wood propeller, and they did a lot of research in that. World War II came along, and a lot of wood was used in support of those war efforts, and the laboratory was right there doing the research. In fact, in the 30s, they had hired scientists and mathematicians to do a lot of the raw data research, particularly strength tables. They would analyze the breaking strength of different species, the modulus of elasticity, how stiff a piece of wood was, the resistance to rot, just all kinds of stuff. And in World War II, this became really valuable. They did a lot of research into shipbuilding because we were using a lot of wood in modern shipbuilding. And all of this came out of the Forest Service Laboratory in Madison. When you're building a deck and you have to calculate your joist spans and the size of timber that you need to use, that information came out of Madison, Wisconsin, the Forest Service Laboratory. Go to their website. They have, it's kind of old school design, but it's overwhelming with the amount of information that they have. They have a Wood Identification 101 program, a series of papers that you can read through, and it gives you step-by-step methods to use to identify different woods. They even have a wood identification program where you can send in pieces of wood and have them identify the wood. Some other things that they do is they get into burn tests of different species to figure out what's more fire resistant. They lend their expertise in designing of homes that are more resistant to wildfire. And one of the videos, they have an entire video list on there. One that caught my eye was baseball bats. And there's a link in the show notes about a video of how the laboratory helped solve the Major League broken bat problem. I'm not making this up. And not surprisingly, it turned out to be a grain runout problem. Duh. But interesting video. You might want to check it out. If you want to take a deep dive into a rabbit hole, study wood baseball bats. Oh my gosh, it is just fascinating. You can have a bat with the grain orientation that will allow that bat to have the propensity to hit a ball into right field or left field. Just really weird stuff that goes into that. The other thing that they're getting into is illegal logging. They are able to identify different tree species, not just by some of the things we're going to talk about, but they get down into the DNA level of tree species. They've done a lot of work with identify Lacey Act violations. If you don't know what the Lacey Act is, it's a law that was created in the early 1900s to cut down on animal and plant exploitation. That was pretty rampant, pretty ugly at that time. And if you do anything with exotic imported woods, you really need to know about the Lacey Act. So if you do use the Forest Service Laboratory Wood Identification Service, it's kind of interesting, just their process. First thing you have to do is download a form and fill it out. And one of the things that they ask about is the origin of this piece of wood. Where did this come from? Where do you think this originated from? Do you have a specific time period you think this was from? And any general characteristics that you can use. And what they're looking for here is statements like, well, this was my great-grandmother's, and she moved from Boston in the 1870s to Iowa, and she brought this piece with her. Okay, that gives those researchers a pretty valuable piece of information. This wood is probably not a West Coast wood because it came from the East Coast. So they can use this type of information to really start to narrow down their choice. So let's go ahead and talk about how do you identify wood. Well, the first thing you do is just what the Forest Service Laboratory did. They ask questions. Where did this come from? What do you know about this piece of wood? You're starting to gather that same information. It's going to help you narrow things down. If someone says, this was a gift from my uncle who traveled extensively in Africa. Okay, that's going to rule out, 5 of the other continents because Antarctica doesn't have trees. The next thing that you do is you feel the wood. Put it in your hands. What is the weight like? Is it a heavy wood? Is it a dense wood? Does it have a high specific gravity? Or is this thing abnormally light? You have probably handled a lot of different species of wood, and you start to get a feel for if something is heavy or if something is light. You can tell the difference between white oak and pine immediately just simply by the feel, the shape of the wood. You can innately figure out roughly what that specific gravity is, irregardless of the size of the wood. So kind of trust your instincts there. Number 2, the color. Now, you have to be really careful when you're looking at the color of wood. You can make almost any wood look like any other wood simply by using color. A really good artist can do this. So just the raw color of the wood under a finish, you can't go by that. You need to see the raw wood. And if it's a broken chair or something, that's easy. You can see the broken part and pretty much tell, from there, what type of wood. Is it a light wood? Is it a dark wood? Also remember, woods change color due to UV exposure. Typically, light woods darken and dark woods will lighten. So you kind of have to keep that. That's why that raw break is so very helpful. Next, you look at the grain structure, the flat grain, and you start comparing that with the images in the wood database book that you've already ordered and have received. That will get you a long way, but kind of the most reliable way of identifying wood is by looking at the end grain structure. Now, this is what gets really, really interesting. So anybody can look at a piece of wood and come up with a guess. But when you take a end grain slice And if you read on the U.S. Forest Service laboratory website, they go through detail on how to do an end grain slice. What you're doing is you're taking the very, very, very tiniest sliver of wood. I remember doing this in high school biology class with various things and then putting them on a microscope slide and looking at their structure under a microscope. In essence, that's what we're doing here, except we're using a magnifying glass or a loupe to look at that grain structure. You don't need a microscope to do this. If you can get a really good, clean crosscut on a piece of wood, it will get you a long, long way, and you don't actually need to take that slice. If you have a good, sharp crosscut blade, usually that will be adequate enough. You can't sand, because then that starts to destroy that wood structure, and that's what we need to see. So by looking at the end grain structure and comparing that to photographs in the wood database book, now we can really narrow things down. You can look at a piece of white oak and a piece of red oak and immediately know which one is which. They're almost like check valves. They have this structure in the tubulars, and you can see that whenever you're looking at the end grain with a loupe. Red oak, you can see clear, open tubulars. You don't see those little check valves. It doesn't have them. So this is a very fascinating way of identifying wood. Until you actually make a bit of a study of this, you probably really have never paid attention to it. But you can tell a lot about a piece of wood by looking at the end grain. The way that the pores are arranged, the early wood, the late wood, there's just all kinds of characteristics. Some woods have no characteristics, which becomes one of the characteristics of that particular type of wood. And one of the last ways of identifying woods is by comparing this piece of wood to your wood sample collection. You don't have a wood sample collection? Well, you need to get started on that, don't you? It's good to have just little chunks of wood. If you want to get really fancy about it, you can make them all uniform, like a 4x4 piece of wood or a 3x3, whatever, maybe half-inch thick, quarter-inch thick. If you use 3/4-inch thick, it gets pretty large pretty quickly. So generally a thinner piece of wood is better. But all the different woods that you use, try to collect that and collect different, species that you use. And if you can make them a uniform size, all the better, because now we can really compare the weight of the wood. A piece of Ligma vitae is going to feel much, much different than a piece of poplar. So when you have done all of that, you come up with your best guess. Honestly, the Forest Service, when you send your sample in, they will get you into the family of wood, but not necessarily a specific species of wood. Their report might come back, this is a piece of mahogany. Oh, great. There's like 100 different species of mahogany. Well, you can only do so much just through a visual inspection, and you probably don't want to pay for a DNA inspection of this. And quite honestly, come on, it's not that important. So if you can narrow it down to, this is a piece of oak, 99.9% of the people will be perfectly happy with that, because they know that there are oak trees. They don't know that there are like 22 different species of oak that qualify as commercial grade white oak. And quite frankly, they don't care. So if you can say this is a piece of pine, this is a walnut, they don't care if it's American black walnut or Carlo walnut. They're not that specific. Is this a piece of maple or is it a piece of poplar? That's what they want to know. Now, one thing to be careful of, don't confuse grain figure with species. The nice little old lady who brings in her treasured mirror and says that the family has always told her that it was flame maple. and then ask, where does flame maple grow? Well, nice little old lady, there really is not a species of wood called flame maple, but rather it's a grain characteristic of probably a soft maple. Now, here's another way we can confuse nice little old ladies. Because, we professional woodworkers, we tend to use commercial terms for different wood species. We'll tell a nice little old lady that this is a piece of soft maple, most likely. What's soft maple? Really good question. Chances are it's silver maple, but it could be a whole bunch of other maples, because there's a whole bunch of maples that commercially fall into the category, the species, of soft maple, not to be confused with hard maple. Wait a minute, what's hard maple? Hard maple in the Midwest, the East, most likely is sugar maple. Well, why don't they call it sugar maple? Because there's other species of maple that have the same characteristics of sugar maple, that they lump them all into hard maple because of the density of the wood. Oh, this is so confusing. Yeah, I know. That's why if you can say this is maple, little old lady's not quite so confused. And she's happy with that. She knows that it's maple. But it's not flame maple, because there's no such thing as flame maple. And we do this all the time. Tiger stripe maple. Well, it's probably a soft maple. That doesn't mean that hard maples can't have tiger stripe, but it's more prevalent in soft maples. Understand? What about ambrosia maple? Oh, come on, that's a species. I know that's a species. Well, no. And it actually has nothing to do with figure. It has to do with discoloration. It has to do with discoloration because of an insect. The ambrosia beetle infects a tree, and it sets up this really weird yet kind of beautiful grain coloration in the tree that you can get a lot more money for. Spalted maple. You may have used spalted maple. Spalted maple is rotting maple. Yes, that is a fungus. That is rot. And you've got to be very, very careful. I've mentioned on this podcast before, be very careful using some of these woods, because especially spalted maple, that is most likely a live, active, critter in there doing this damage to the wood fibers, and it really likes, moist, dark places, which is what your lungs are. I've talked to several people who have had respiratory infection due to spalted maple exposure. Not that you're going to get that just by picking up a piece of spalted maple, but if you're sanding it, or if you're doing, turning with it, oh yeah, you need to take precautions. But also remember, you can get more money for rotted wood, spalted maple, than you can for just a plain piece of maple. And just when we thought we were starting to kind of figure some things out, there are some other non-typical wood species that you need to be aware of. Barnwood. Do you have barnwood growing in your area? It has a pretty wide area across the U.S. and Europe, and I'm sure Australia has, barnwood. Yeah, what is barnwood? Barnwood's not a species. It's a type of use. This was wood that was used to build a barn. In the Midwest, Indiana, Ohio area, we used a lot of poplar. What? Poplar? Poplar doesn't have very good rot resistance. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't. You throw a piece of poplar on the ground, come back in 2 weeks, you'll see some rot. But you hang it on the side of a barn where it can get rained on, it can get baked on by the sun, and the wind blows on it and keeps it dry, it can be there for 100 years. Easy. So you'll see, especially in reclaimed, furniture and things like this, somebody will get barnwood and will make birdhouses out of it, or a headboard or something like this. What is barnwood? We have no idea. It could be poplar, it could be pine, it could be maple. We don't know. You have to go through and actually, break the wood, get good ingrain, slices and identify it that way. How about widow wood? And with the baby boomers really starting to age out, there's a lot of widow wood, coming onto the market. This is wood that a woodworker had stacked in the overhead of his basement workshop, or maybe out into a little shed on the corner of the property, and he unfortunately has passed away, and the widow now has to deal with all of his stuff, and it has the term widow wood, which is really too bad. And of course, there is also no-knot wood. This is a rather popular species in a lot of areas where you look at the piece of wood, you check the flat grain structure, you look at the end grain structure, you measure the density of the weight of the wood, and you just kind of shake your head and purse your lips and say, I think this is no-knot wood. Really? No-knot? I've never heard of that. Yeah, neither have I, because I have no idea what this wood is. No-knot wood. And you can also occasionally come across some rescue wood. This is wood that usually you get a phone call or maybe a text message from somebody who knows that you're a wood guy or a wood gal. And, hey, my uncle is moving into a nursing home and he has a whole bunch of wood in his garage. We wanted to know if you might want to rescue it from the dumpster. So there, we have rescue wood. Anyway, this is a fascinating subject. Some people really take a deep dive into this. In fact, there's a group of people, men and women, who have really gone down the rabbit hole. These are the folks at the International Wood Collectors Society. I am not making this up. There's a link in the show notes, woodcollectors.org. This is a group of people. Many of them are woodworkers. Many of them are collectors. And they collect wood species from all over the world. They're not satisfied with collecting white oak. Those 22 different species that make up the commercial definition of white oak. No, they want the individual pieces of those 22 different species. And it is really fascinating. I have run into these folks at the woodworking shows in past years. Always worth a stop and a chat. It's amazing what they find. I mean, botanists, seek out their advice because they just really, really, really get into the minutia. In fact, a lot of their members are botanists, scientists, researchers, and a lot of them are just, everyday, amateur woodworkers and a few professional woodworkers who have this interest. You can join them for, I think it's $40 a year. There's a really, really nice journal that they publish once a year. That in itself is probably worth the $40. And they have different meetups. They have a international convention in Australia this year. I was reading on their website. There's a national convention in Texas, I think in October. And there's regional groups, regional clubs that they'll put on different, shows and programs within your state or your local area. The recommendations for the week is all of these that I have mentioned. Links in the show notes, a lot of information. This is really easy to get into data overload, but if you start nibbling at it, taking a little piece at a time, it is just fascinating what you can learn about wood that for a lot of us, we just kind of, cherry, walnut, maple. Missed jobs this week. To be honest, I had a few, but we had the holiday, so I can't really remember. Kitchen cabinets seem to be a really hot topic right now. So I want to thank you for listening today and remind you about my affiliate links, Unitel Voice, Voice over IP for all of your cellular phone needs for your business, and of course Skillshare, the online learning platform that you can get a 30% off if you use the coupon code in the show notes and learn something new. And of course, I would really appreciate it if, a couple of you were to buy me a cup of coffee on the link in the show notes, and that really helps to support the show. So until next week, happy woodworking.